Hey everybody, I hope you are doing okay. This is a chapter, rather, from Looking for the Proletariat by Stephen Hastings-King, about Socialisme ou Barbarie. This chapter is titled Where Things Start. Like you've probably heard me say in other videos in the other video from this book, that I don't know how much of this I'm going to read, because it's specifically about worker writing, and that's not really what my research interests are, even though that's fascinating. What I'm trying to do here is just get as much background information as I can about Socialisme ou Barbarie, and particularly its formation, its relation to Trotskyism, and its conception of the USSR. So here we go. Where things start. Imagine that you're in Paris in early 1949. You sit in a cafe and hold in your hands a copy of the first issue of Socialisme ou Barbarie. The cover is printed on heavy paper. It is white with a red horizontal band across the top. Quote, Socialisme appears inside the red horizontal in a black font. Ou Barbarie is just below, smaller in the white area. A thin red line makes the right lower quadrant of the white area a discrete space, within which is arrayed the table of contents drawn by some curiosity. You open up the journal and begin to read. In the opening pages of Socialisme ou Barbarie number 1, the group introduces itself. The quote, presentation appears without an attributed author and is printed in italics. The italics give the piece a sense of unfolding in a metaspace just above the rest of the issue. The introduction tells you that Socialisme ou Barbarie is the name of the journal and the group of revolutionary militants who produced the journal. The group began within Trotskyism, but was led progressively to distance itself from Trotskyism because of Trotskyism's, quote, reformist attitudes, parenthesis, in the deepest sense, end parenthesis, with respect to Stalinism, combined with an effort to maintain intact the Bolshevik politics from the heroic period in the face of a constantly evolving reality, end quote. Socialisme ou Barbarie. It should not be of surprise that the group originated within Trotskyism. Some kind of relationship with the movement is more or less inevitable for one who positions him or herself as a revolutionary and comes to understand the problems created by Stalinism. But Socialisme ou Barbarie was driven to break with Trotskyism, following a logic that would be shared by any worker. Despite being the main organizational expression of anti-Stalinist revolutionary politics, Trotskyism provided no response to basic questions. What is Russia? What is Stalinism? What are its social bases? What are its economic roots? How to understand the bureaucracy that has dominated Russia since the early 1930s and Eastern Europe since 1945. The group understands the development and expansion of bureaucracy to be the defining characteristic of contemporary capitalism. Bureaucracy is the fundamental problem. Analyzing bureaucracy is the thread they pull. What unifies bureaucracies is the division of intellectual labor that separates the dirigeant from the exécutant, which is like order giver and order taker, commander and commanded. Those who direct from those who carry out directions. Seen in this way, bureaucracy is a command system. The situations which it now occupies make of it a new configuration of power. Those who occupy places within these bureaucracies form a new social class. The actions of this new social class have transformed and will continue to transform both the relations of production and the potentials for revolutionary action. The quote presentation then situates the group in its preoccupations with respect to Marxism. The way this is carried out indicates a combination of immersion in that tradition and iconoclasm with respect to it. The group rejects orthodox Marxism. Given the emphasis on the present, it makes little sense to adopt, quote, a relationship to Marx like that which Catholic theologians adopt towards Scripture, end quote. Socialisme ou Barbarie. Marxian analytical frameworks are only useful as long as they illuminate developments in the contemporary world. When they do not, they will be abandoned. The priority is not fidelity to Marx, but to provide a coherent orientation for a revolutionary politics a revolutionary politics adequate to the post-war world. Quote, without development of revolutionary theory, there can be no development of revolutionary action, unquote. Socialisme ou Barbarie. The article assumes the prerogative that subtends this relation to Marxism, but the relation is a process, as is the group itself. The journal will be its reflection, a forum for analysis, reflection, and debate. Quote, the discussion will be free within the context of our general conceptions, with the constant hope that they will not become an endless dialogue among a few individuals, end quote. Socialisme ou Barbarie. The group addresses the reader and a broader working class audience simultaneously. Socialisme ou Barbarie characterizes its project as based on new forms of proletarian revolutionary action, which are linked to the specific nature of worker experience in both the Soviet and Western forms of contemporary capitalism. The project will require extensive analytical and political work. It is presented with a sense of urgency. In 1949, the logic of concentration that both explains and drives the confrontation between imperial blocs appears to be heading toward a third world war. Only a proletarian revolution can stop it, once the alternative, socialism or barbarism. Footnote, on the opposition, as, quote, a presently contending alternative, end quote, see Curtis, 1989, end footnote. New section, Imago Mundi. I'm assuming that means world image. The article entitled Socialisme ou Barbarie is also without an attributed author. Footnote, the piece was published without attribution but was written by Cornelius Castoriadis. End footnote. The typeset uses the same font that can be found throughout the rest of the journal's content. The reader enters the interior of the group's project and is presented with a map of the world, its structure and theory of history, derived from Marx's Communist Manifesto, which is extensively cited in the opening pages of the text. History moves in stages. Each stage is discrete. One stage emerges from within and supplants another. The history that is presented is that of bureaucratic capitalism. The presentation is divided into two parts, each of which provides a broad outline of the international situation in order to situate and make a frame around Socialisme ou Barbarie's conception of the revolutionary project. Quote, bourgeoisie and bureaucracy, end quote, outlines a history of Western capitalism. Driven by the logic of concentration, the stage of nationally based competitive capitalism was supplanted by that of monopoly capitalism between 1880 and 1890. World War I represented the explosion of the monopoly capitalist political order. As it was for Lenin, World War I was the political and military result of imperialist competition between national monopoly sectors for access to cheap raw materials for large-scale industry. While the state forms particular to monopoly capitalism broke down as a result of the war, imperialism remained as both a result of concentration and as one of its motors. The main result of World War I was the convergence of monopoly sectors of the economy and the state and the proliferation of bureaucracies that mediated economic activity. In heavy industry, the development of management unfolded along a parallel trajectory. World War II resulted from the inability of the forms of bureaucratic capitalism instituted after the Great Depression to manage capitalist crisis. By 1949, it appeared that the end of the war had been accompanied by a new, more thoroughgoing form of bureaucratic capitalism. But the logic of concentration and imperialism continued to push events forward. The end result is likely to be a third world war. The second section, titled Proletariat and Bureaucracy, provides an overview of the history of the workers' movement since the 19th century, its consolidation through the Second International, and its failure from a revolutionary viewpoint. It then turns to the Russian Revolution and provides an indication of the trajectory whereby the revolution gave way to a fusion of party and state. The revolution had expropriated capitalists and abolished private property. But rather than issuing in socialism, the result was state control over economic activity. The editorial links this in part to the logic of the Leninist vanguard party. The separation of the dirigeant from the exécutant, those who command from those who carry out the commands, was repeated in the separation of a party of professional revolutionaries from a working class unable to achieve revolutionary consciousness without its intervention in the fusion of party and state. Production was nationalized under the slogan of workers' control. Due to acute shortages in skilled labor, worker control entailed an educational process that would enable the workers to assume control at some future point. In the meantime, the party cobbled together a managerial apparatus from the specialists it could locate. The party state then acted in the name of worker control to institute the same approaches to production found in advanced Western industry, first in its tailorist, then in its Fordist form. The editorial characterizes this as the turning point, past which the party state apparatus began to fully separate from the workers and impose itself as a new ruling stratum. With the 1921 New Economic Plan, it's the New Economic Policy, but it says New Economic Plan here. With the 1921 New Economic Plan begins full-blown Soviet bureaucratic capitalism. The Soviet apparatus consolidates its power over the international communist movement with the Third International and imposes its ideological and organizational models on the communist parties. In France, this will become evident with the transformation of the Parti Communiste Français into a mass political party after the 1936 Popular Front. A parallel process unfolded in the trade union movement, with the Confédération Générale du Travail acting as the French exemplar. Footnote. We'll leave a closer account of what this means in the French context for Chapter 3 and what follows. End footnote. The editorial claims that the working class of 1949 was aware of this history and had derived from it some fundamental lessons. The older objectives that had been central for the workers' movement throughout the Russian Revolution were no longer viable. This history has shown that the expropriation of capitalists, the abolition of private property through its nationalization, and all the modes of designating, quote, workers' control, to that point were not adequate to bring about the institution of socialism. The bureaucratization of the Soviet system engendered new and particularly brutal forms of exploitation of the workers and peasants. The bureaucratization of Western left-wing parties and trade unions accompanied their integration into the normal operations of the capitalist status quo. In both contexts, the political dimensions of bureaucratization, as combined with the new managerial and technological development that rationalized and intensified the exploitation of workers. The lesson that the working class had drawn from all this was the need to rethink the meaning of socialism and revolution. Quote, it must be understood that the expropriation of private capital by the state or nationalization, in parenthesis, by the state or nationalization, in parenthesis, is only the negative half of the proletarian revolution. These measures can have no positive significance if they are separated from the positive half, the direct management of production by the workers. This means that the directing of the economy from the level of central overall direction to that of businesses cannot be left to a stratum of specialists, technicians, and competent, quote, capable people, end quote, and other bureaucrats. It must be undertaken by the workers themselves. The dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be merely political. Above all, it must be an economic dictatorship. Otherwise, it will only become a slogan that conceals the dictatorship of the bureaucracy, end quote. Castoriadis. It remained for a new revolutionary movement, one aware of history and able to articulate the basic conceptual and political orientations inherited from the past, to elaborate the basis for a new revolutionary project. For Socialisme Barbarie, this would center on direct worker management of production and, by extension, of society. New section. Where things begin. Leaving Trotskyism. One second. Come on, you son of a gun. Alright, there we are. Sorry. New section. Where things begin. Leaving Trotskyism. The post-war left was a field of cultural production that in its overall logic conformed to the way Pierre Bourdieu characterized such fields in general. Quote, one of the most significant properties of the fields of cultural production is that they propose to those who work within them a space of possibilities, if you like, a problematic, parenthesis, objectively given in the form of an ensemble of real or possible positions, end parenthesis, which tend to orient the research, even without their being aware of it, by defining the universe of possible questions. This problematic both fixes their enterprise in time and space and makes it relatively independent with respect to direct social and economic determinants. Product of the history of the field itself, this space is marked by the ensemble of intellectual benchmarks, often incarnated in intellectual, quote, stars or various, quote, isms. These must be mastered, at least in practice, in order to participate in the game. Above and beyond all agents, this space functions as a sort of common reference system that situates contemporaries, even when they do not consciously refer to each other, by virtue of their common situation within the same intellectual system, end quote. Bourdieu, 1989. For Bourdieu, cultural power is at stake in the playing out of the game of position within a given cultural field. Footnote. For an outline of how one might use Bourdieu's work to think about left-wing politics in particular, see Bourdieu 1980C and 1981. For the notion of the field of cultural distribution in particular, see Bourdieu 1989. The relation of the notion of field to history is elaborated in Bourdieu 1980B. End footnote. And I don't know what those dates refer to, or what titles those dates are referred to. Cultural power is the ability to impose end footnote. Cultural power is the ability to impose one's frame of reference. The logic that informs his analysis has been characterized as legitimist to the extent that it operates with the assumption that power is the goal for all players. While the model is illuminating in several respects, the quote fit between it and revolutionary political organizations comes at a price. For example, Trotskyism fits into it because of the nature of Trotskyism's relations to the dominant communist parties and its mode of argumentation. The price one pays is the reduction of revolution to a rhetorical tactic in a struggle for position within a field of cultural production. Everyone who plays a game assumes that the game itself is legitimate. So, if one takes Bourdieu's modeling seriously, revolutionary political positions that operated within a given field of cultural production placed out of play the field itself and the socioeconomic context that shape it because they operated within that field at all. Of course, each would assume that the outcome of play would be improved were they to become dominant. The post-war French left was dominated by the French Communist Party, in part to compensate for the disparities that separated the PCF from revolutionary opposition groups. The latter articulated their positions using forms of, quote, heretical subversion, end quote. Bourdieu generalized the term from Max Weber's notion of cultural reproduction, a cross-conflict between bureaucratic priests and charismatic prophets. Footnote. The variant heretical argumentation is taken from Bourdieu 1984, end footnote. Heretical subversion relies on a form of argument that collapses ongoing cultural production by dominant positions back onto the text that comprise their doctrinal and historical core. The appeal to sources is used to argue that the original messages have been distorted or abandoned. The appeal to history enables the fashioning of counter-histories that demonstrate the arbitrariness of both the dominant position itself and the history shaped in its image. The use of this approach eliminated the obvious asymmetries separating groups that rarely numbered 100 members from the PCF, which counted over 2 million members and won nearly 25% of the popular vote in the 1947 parliamentary elections. All organizations were rendered as abstract, equivalent sources of ideological positions. Footnote. This compensation works in another way, quite different from what one would associate with the pattern of heretical argumentation outlined above. By routing critiques of the Communist Party of France through Stalinism, it created a sense of distance with respect to it. This distance was also a form of containment that was a condition of possibility for writing oppositional text in such an asymmetrical context. This chapter recapitulates that sense of distance in its exclusive focus on Socialisme Barbarie when we turn to politics in the Renault factory at Boulogne-Billancourt, Boulogne-Billancourt in chapter 4, as well as in subsequent chapters. This sense of distance will abruptly come undone. End footnote. A correlate of this was that heretical argumentation also reduced political affiliation to the type of commitment particular to small organizations comprised of revolutionary militants. The Trotskyism of this period conformed particularly well to a model rooted in conflict between a charismatic prophet and bureaucratic priests. Trotsky's personality, eloquence, and prestige as a function of his close association with the Russian Revolution made of Trotsky a quintessential charismatic prophet. this material and the political situations that he confronted after his 1928 exile made heretical argumentation the only logical form with which to advance his claims to be Lenin's legitimate successor. The particularities of Trotsky's situation made it simple to transpose these claims into the language of revolution. The broader political movement that took shape around Trotsky and Trotsky's writings replicated both his preoccupations and modes of argument. The thematic content of the text from the first issue of Socialisme ou Barbarie, outlined in the sections above, show a group still deeply imprinted by its origins as the Chalut mental tendency within the left opposition of the Fourth International. Trotsky's personal associations set up the centrality of Lenin, the USSR, and Stalinism as political and analytical questions in his written work. Trotsky's particular analyses of Stalin established the link between the latter and the question of bureaucracy. The association of Stalin with bureaucracy that enabled the separation of the, quote, real revolution from Stalinism and the Leninist vanguard party from the bureaucracy that supplanted it was critical for Trotsky's positioning of himself as the keeper of the flame of real revolution. The understanding of the latter as a second proletarian revolution had been staged against the screen of the USSR and Stalinism throughout Trotsky's work. This second revolution was to be its reversal both logically and politically. These registers converged in the centrality of worker control and of ideas and the idea of Soviets or councils. From this followed the importance of claims to be closer to the workers in the game of position, both with respect to other Fourth International tendencies and with respect to the dominant communist parties. To position oneself close to the workers was to move along the natural horizon of Marxian discourse and doctrine, and to demonstrate a better command of Marxism and a higher level of doctrinal purity, just as Trotsky had done with respect to Stalin. From this follows the curious melange of highly technical language and modes of addressing the working class in text, the production of which was both a mode of differentiation and a form of militant activity. Footnote: in the French context of 1949, it also was a result of the reduction of political affiliation to the comportments particular to small organizations comprised of revolutionary militants. End footnote. This move was also figured against the history of Leninism as a movement back to the idea of the party, articulated in the 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done, in which the production of such texts is a form of political action during periods without particular hope for revolution. Their mixed nature follows from the Bolshevik emphasis on maintaining a clear distinction between the inside and the outside of the organization through clarity of political line. These concerns and the forms of practice that accompany them structure the particular notion of being revolutionary. The context in which these practices were situated tied together militants and organization. By the time the Chalut mental tendency split with the Parti Communiste Internationaliste, PCI, in 1949, it had already broken with the Fourth International majority on a number of grounds. The Chalut mental tendency had been started in 1946 on the basis of the, quote, Russian question. Footnote: we return to this in the next two sections of this chapter. End footnote. They rejected Trotsky's interpretation of Stalinism. They rejected open questions of what Stalinism was and how it could be explained. Their rejection, open questions of what Stalinism was and how Stalinism could be explained. The Chalut mental tendency developed its collective critique of both Stalinism and the dominant Trotskyist interpretations of Stalinism around the category of bureaucracy. The tendency subsumed Leninist conceptions of political organization into their critique of bureaucracy. This move opened space for a rethink of the nature of revolutionary organization and of the proletarian revolution that it would work to bring about. The fashioning of these positions entailed an independent return to the sources of the Marxian tradition. The result was a relation to Marx quite unlike that found in Trotsky or in the post-war majority tendencies. But this relation had yet to have any significant impact on the conceptual or linguistic devices used in the initial text published in Socialisme ou Barbarie. And Socialisme ou Barbarie had not yet at all moved from the inherited assumption that the Soviet Union was the telos toward which the West was moving, an assumption that derived from the position occupied by the Russian Revolution in the dominant Marxist understanding of the revolutionary tradition. The 1949 positions outlined by Socialisme Barbarie were extensions of those articulated by Ch.1, but they are not on their own explanations for the decision to leave the Parti Communiste Internationaliste. In the text collected and published as In Defense of Marxism, Trotsky had written that if a second proletarian revolution was not triggered by the Second World War in the USSR, then the basis for revolutionary opposition would then have to be rethought. Footnote. See The Present War and the Fate of Modern Society in the September 1939 text, The USSR and War, which is on this channel, of course. Trotsky's assassination in 1940 confronted post-war Trotskyism with a problem. The movement had been fashioned around Trotsky as the main source of political orientation. Without Trotsky, there was neither a center nor a clear source for legitimate theoretical propositions. Majority tendencies within the post-war Fourth International cauterized the problem by creating an orthodoxy based on Trotsky's writings and the form of dialectical materialism that subtended them. Left opposition tendencies like the Ch.1 tendency and the U.S.-based Johnson Forrest tendency took Trotsky's last writings as their point of departure and began to carry out the project they called for. Because the opposition departed from Trotsky's work, the orthodoxy of the majority necessarily included space for it. Even a demolition of both Trotsky's interpretations of Stalinism and the association that would link Trotsky to proletarian revolution, like Lafour's 1948 essay, Les Contradictions de Trotsky, could be accommodated. That piece is on this channel. The project called for in the last writings requires such a displacement. While these divergent trajectories created moments of awkward coexistence, the majority tendencies had neither the power nor interest to exclude the opposition. By the summer of 1948, the question of whether or not to leave the Parti Communiste Internationaliste had been debated within the Ch.1 tendency for some time. The transcript of a meeting from May 1948 provides a glimpse of what the members understood to be at stake. Footnote. No footnote. The discussion was shaped by a dispute between Castoriadis and Lafour about what the critique of the Leninist vanguard party entailed for a new revolutionary organization. Footnote. On the trajectory performed by this dispute through the history of Socialisme Barbarie, see Poirier and Cholet. End footnote. The main positions have been presented as written interventions. The critique linked the separation of a cadre of professional revolutionaries from the masses to the development of the Stalinist state bureaucracy. Lenin's justification of the party lay in its ability to elaborate perspectives that would allow the masses to transcend attachment to the immediate and attain the class consciousness required for revolutionary action. Ch.1 saw in the separation of the party from the masses that of the separation of dirigeants from exécutants, which made of the party a bureaucratic organization. The Soviet system under Stalin was an unfolding of its implications. The critique was straightforward when the object of analysis was the Soviet Union, but its implications for a new revolutionary organization admitted of several possibilities. Footnote. The dispute that shaped this 1948 meeting would recur periodically in almost the same terms across the trajectory of Socialisme Barbarie until Lafour left the group in 1958. End footnote. Lafour took from the critique of Leninism the conclusion that any party organization was the germinal form of the bureaucratic state. A revolutionary organization should be a, quote, committee of struggle, end quote, the activities of which would be restricted to creating linkages between and commenting upon actions that arise, quote, from below. It would have no independent organizational status. Quote, the essential problem is to fashion ourselves as a revolutionary corps. I do not say, quote, party intentionally. At present, there is no possibility of building a revolutionary party. Liu still believes there is an actual worker avant-garde. But the truth is that the Trotskyists react to certain events without any bracket corresponding end bracket class reaction. End quote. Before. The quote Revolutionary Corps would comprise militants who would produce historical and political writing that would empower worker movements. Footnote. This is a footnote that I missed. This is a recurrent term for Lefort. It refers to a group of revolutionary militants whose objective is to empower worker movements with the idea of merging into them. The idea is similar to that held by Johnson Forrest. We take up their position in Chapter 5. End footnote. And the term being referred to there is Revolutionary Corps. Anyway, end footnote. The quote Revolutionary Corps would comprise militants who would produce historical and political writing that would empower worker movements. These would be produced while the organization itself was merged with the movement. Connection to and reliance upon, quote, the spontaneity of the masses, end quote, was critical, not only in principle, but also because, quote, in the times of greatest crisis, quote, the farthest flights of theory fall short of the reality of the proletarian revolution, end quote, end quote. Footnote, typescript of a speech from the 2nd of May 1948 in Castoriadis papers. The references to the Johnson Forrest tendencies 1947, the invading socialist society. End footnote. This position translated ambivalences concerning the organizational form of the Parti Communiste Internationaliste itself. The ongoing internal problems became adequate grounds for leaving. Castoriadis rejected these arguments both theoretically and in their pragmatic consequences. He characterized Lefort as someone who, quote, basing himself on the spontaneity of the masses, seeks new ways to not build a party, end quote. Castoriadis. Footnote, typescript of his speech from the 2nd of May 1948 in Castoriadis papers. End footnote. Rehearsing Lenin's critique of, quote, tailism, end quote, Castoriadis argued, quote, to rely only on the spontaneity of the masses is to abstract yourself from society and the way in which revolution itself develops, end quote. Castoriadis. Footnote, handwritten edition, tailism, quote, tail enders, expressions originally coined by Lenin to describe the economists who deny the leading role of the party and the importance of theory in the working class movement. Their position implied that the party should trail after the spontaneously developing movement, follow in the tail of events. End footnote. This offered two possibilities for political action: immersion in very local situations, or the development of a revolutionary line. The first tends towards incoherence because it dissolves any possibility of a revolutionary line. The second makes the, quote, committee of struggle, end quote, a party that operates behind a different name. Castoriadis counterposed a notion of revolutionary organization as a stream of, quote, continuous propaganda, end quote, that quote, does not repeat what the workers are doing, but emphasizes what the workers could do, end quote, by, quote, placing the revolutionary mission in front of them, end quote. As Lefort pointed out, subtending this notion of organization is the belief in a kind of dialogue with the worker avant-garde. Without this dialogue, Castoriadis' position is Leninist. With it, perhaps this position is something else. While this may have gone without saying in 1948, the increasing East-West polarization that accompanied the early phases of the Cold War was squeezing out space for both revolutionary opposition to the Communist Party of France and for autonomous worker action. These latter would demonstrate that there was a worker avant-garde with which dialogue would be possible. If this formation is historically variable, then the status of a revolutionary organization would vary functionally. Were one to apply Lefort's position to guide a response to that variability, the Revolutionary Corps would go silent during these periods. Applying Castoriadis' position would enable the organization to continue engaging in propaganda activities that would reflect its orientation toward dialogue when a change of situation enabled it. These positions shaped the tendency's debate. The militants aligned with Lafleur advocated a break with the PCI. Those aligned with Castoriadis opposed it. The discussion itself rehearsed mostly pragmatic reasons for staying or leaving. Those aligned with Lafleur assumed that departure would dissolve the tendency as an organization. This eliminated concerns about continuity and simplified the question at hand. Those aligned with Castoriadis outlined a series of pragmatic reasons for remaining with the PCI. The internal culture of the PCI often smothered discussion. Salut Mental provided them a space. This was a significant aspect of the tendency's appeal. The cycling through of new militants that resulted from that appeal would be lost were they to leave. The party provided the basis for contact with other tendencies internationally. This epistolary network included the Johnson Forest tendency, which is a fundamental political interlocuteur for the tendency, the Salut Mental tendency, and Socialisme Barbarie. The party provided a base for coalition building among parallel political organizations. Footnote: As an example, the transcript mentions in passing work being carried out with the Fédération Anarchiste at the time. And footnote. Just a side note. Within the the left, the French left of Trotskyism, in addition to Socialisme Barbarie, there was also Daniel Guérin. And I think Daniel Guérin would have been the person who was organizing with the Fédération Anarchiste. And I believe André Breton, the surrealist poet, was also would eventually also come to work with the Anarchist Federation in France. And he was a Trotskyist, of course, right? So, anyway, continuing on. End footnote. Most importantly, the PCI provided the tendency the material base for the circulation of texts within the International and the possibility for the distribution beyond the confines of the party. It was the substructure for political work. The Parti Communiste Internationaliste screened the people with whom the tendency came into contact. In Castoriadis' view, outside that context, Lafleur's, quote, committee of struggle, end quote, was doomed to become, quote, a discussion group that would involve people met at random, end quote. Castoriadis. A bit later, after apologizing for the breach of decorum he was about to commit, Castoriadis pointed to the class composition of the tendency. It was made up of, quote, intellectuals and petits bourgeois, end quote. Outside the party milieu, its class composition would assert itself and the group would, quote, wander off on tangents, end quote. Footnote. These paragraphs are a compressed synopsis of the views expressed in PV, 2nd of May. And footnote. In the spring of 1948, most of those involved in the Salut Mental tendency still understood the Parti Communiste Internationaliste as a necessary milieu. Practical interaction with it kept a check on the class composition of the group and anchored it in a space that enabled a sense of contact with the working class. The anchoring was largely a social effect which followed from the various networks from which the Salut Mental tendency was a part. The milieu also provided orientation for the tendency's textual production. The party was the material base for the production and dissemination of texts within the organization, the international, and beyond. Footnote. This is among the points enumerated by Castoriadis for staying. End footnote. It also enabled the reception of these texts. Tendency writings made extensive use of the style of heretical argumentation. Such arguments and the rhetoric that accompanies them are turned inward. The result was texts that primarily addressed other militants, but were written as if they addressed the working class directly. In this respect, the revolutionary left was a field of cultural production, like one in which, quote, musicians' music, end quote, circulates, a space comprised of practitioners whose work largely addresses other practitioners amongst whom virtuosity is valued so long as it operates within certain genre conventions. musicians' music circulates largely without the intermediaries to stratify reception for the benefit of a broader audience by telling their audience that lay beyond the field of practitioners what it is that they like to like and ways in which they like to like those things. But the assumption that one's work can nonetheless reach a broader audience is operative because it is reinforced socially within the community. This relation is effective so long as the context remains transparent. In other words, just as the rules disappear into a game as it is being played, so in the medium term, a readership comprised of other militants would disappear. They held together the assumption that the working class was the actual addressee of these texts. This may explain why the mention of Chulumental tendencies class composition was a breach of decorum. It threatened a disruption of the transparency of context, and by extension, basic assumptions about the way in which the members of the Chulumental tendency were revolutionaries. The discussion from the spring of 1948 is interspersed with references to squaring the tendency's political viewpoints with tactical choices made by the PCI majority. The consensus was that it was not problematic to maintain party discipline so long as doing so did not conflict with matters of principle. In a 1973 interview, Castoriadis provides an account of Chulumental's trajectory through the Parti Communiste Internationaliste. Castoriadis connects the tendency's decision to leave the PCI with Tito's split from the Comintern in the summer of 1949. The PCI majority framed the Eastern European countries under Soviet control as capitalist. This resulted in a wholesale misrecognition of what was happening in Yugoslavia. On the basis of that misunderstanding, the Parti Communiste Internationaliste called for a united front with the Yugoslavian Communist Party. So far as Chulumental was collectively concerned, it was a Stalinist organization. And it was, and that's kind of a shared opinion that they have with the bureaucratic collectivist theorists in the United States. And what is interesting, I remember doing some selective reading from this book in the past, but it doesn't seem to say, which is an important part, that for Castoriadis, while rejecting the degenerated workers' state thesis, also rejected characterizing the USSR as capitalist, kind of drawing on, I think, Trotsky's kind of critique of state capitalist theories in The Revolution Betrayed, that they're kind of like a recourse to familiar terms that don't really describe the novel situation. But he eventually does come to characterize the USSR as capitalist without, I believe, really explaining why he chose to do so. Or anyone in the group doing so, for that matter. Anyway. A united front with Stalinists was the final straw. Footnote. The statement about party discipline is drawn from the May 1948 debate cited below. In it, the question of following the Parti Communiste Internationaliste lines that ran counter to the Chulumental tendency positions was broached. Most who mentioned it argued that they were able to act in accordance with discipline without compromising principle. This line did not allow for that. End footnote. The open letter to the militants of the PCI and Fourth International, which I don't think is on this channel but should be, because there's a couple of letters to the Fourth International at this time, for instance from Natalia Sadova Trotsky, as well as Grandisa Muniz, that I have recorded. I don't know if I put them on this channel yet. The open letter to the militants of the PCI and Fourth International, published in Socialisme Barbarie No. 1, provides a more detailed account. By the summer of 1949, the sense of imbrications evident in the discussion from the previous spring had been snapped. Where in 1948, the party had provided the CMT with a material base, social reinforcements, and access to a readership, it was now characterized as, quote, a tiny machine spinning in a void, end quote. Socialisme Barbarie. The organization's preoccupation with the ongoing internal problems created by Trotsky's assassination had been exacerbated by the pressure of Cold War polarization. By the summer of 1949, it precluded everything else. The collapsed Chulumental tendency back onto itself. This collapsed the Chulumental tendency back onto itself. The tendency's political line and its development was now the center of its collective identity. Because the Parti Communiste Internationaliste had become so caught up in its own devolution, it had not developed, quote, an autonomous ideological basis, end quote. It was therefore incapable of any coherent understanding of the contemporary world. This misrecognition of the nature of the Yugoslavian Communist Party was a prime example. It followed directly from an inadequate understanding of the nature of bureaucratic capitalism. The letter presents the break as a consequence of the ideological development of the chalut mental tendency. Juxtaposed with the 1948 debate, the outlines of collective disinvestment in the social milieu that operated under the aegis of the party emerged as a determining factor in shaping the end of the chalut mental tendency and the beginning of Socialisme Barbarie. Political differences with the majority that had remained within tolerable limits became insuperable problems as a result. The recentering of the tendency on its own political project was an aspect of this. By the end of the letter, the Parti Communiste Internationaliste is characterized as a dead thing in a way that calls to mind the breakup of a love affair. What the letter does not say is that Socialisme Barbarie was now moving into political terrain whose history is littered with groups that quickly disappeared because they were unable to fashion ways to develop politically, intellectually, and personally. The group defied this history because of the way it approached itself as a collective project. The category of bureaucracy was central to this. The next section provides a closer analysis of it. New section. The theory of bureaucratic collectivism. Socialisme Barbarie used a particular notion of bureaucracy as a relative idea to shape their assessments of contemporary capitalism and the revolutionary project. Because it is fundamental to understanding Socialisme Barbarie, this section steps out of the historical narrative to present an overview. The opening section of this chapter provided a synopsis of the group's staging of the post-war situation as bureaucratic capitalism. This section provides a minimal reminder before turning to the presentation of the group's usage of bureaucracy. For Socialisme Barbarie, contemporary capitalism was a new form of organization characterized primarily by the proliferation of bureaucracy and transformations in its functions and meanings. These changes describe several trajectories. In the Soviet Union, the fusion of party and state comprised the central moment. In the West, the fusion of the economy's monopoly sectors with the state resulted in a proliferation of bureaucratic mechanisms for the redistribution of resources and mitigation of the effects of the cyclical nature of capitalism. The second main trajectory emerged from within advanced industrial production, following on the creation of management as the controlling stratum in Fordist-style production. The role and nature of managerial bureaucracy in industrial contexts differed fundamentally from networks of clerks processing orders and generating paperwork described by Balzac or in Melville's Bartleby, the Scrivener. The new state bureaucracy is charged with administering socio-economic planning either by sector, West, or for entire economies, Soviet, also different in kind from the 19th century Prussian state bureaucracy that was characterized in Marx's critique of the philosophy of right as an epiphenomenon of singular mediocrity and incompetence. In these 19th century manifestations, bureaucracies were restricted to administrative functions separated from the relations of production. From this followed the Marxian categorization of bureaucracy as a means, a mode of transferring information from one part of the superstructure to another. As was noted in the previous section, Socialisme Barbarie's point of departure for taking up bureaucracy was Trotsky's framing on the, quote, Russian question, while the group was still part of the Fourth International. The critique is here split between this section and the beginning of the next section. In Socialisme Barbarie's general view, Trotsky merely transposed the 19th century Marxian understanding of bureaucracy into the center of his interpretation of Stalinism. In that context, bureaucracy is less an analytical category than it was an expression of Stalin's illegitimacy that grafted like a parasite onto the revolution and endlessly repeated its silent characteristics of being illegitimate in the heavy-handed brutality and ineptness that accompanied the rapid expansion of Soviet industry and collectivization of agriculture across the 1930s. Footnote: the most explicit statement is Trotsky, 1941, I'm not sure what that is. The same basic ideas can be found throughout Trotsky, 1945. I guess these are collections. 1941 might be in defense of Marxism. Anyway, end footnote. Trotsky's usage fulfilled tactical functions as well as in separation of the revolution proper from its Stalinist, quote, betrayal, and of Leninist organization from the state forms created under Stalin, because Trotsky believed that the Second Proletarian Revolution would sweep away Stalin and his institutional expression. Bureaucracy required no further analytical attention. Footnote: this is a recurrent critique of Trotsky in Socialisme Barbarie. End footnote. This is a side note from myself. I think there's a very good piece on here that talks about Marx and bureaucracy. And the thing that's really interesting here in that piece is it talks about how Marx understood bureaucracy in production, right? Whereas Trotsky's emphasis on bureaucracy in the Soviet Union is more or less segregated from from the level of production, right? It's focusing strictly on the state bureaucracy, which is not really particularly legitimate, especially in the Soviet Union, where the state controls and dictates what happens on the level of production, right? Or at least attempts to maximally, even if it fails to, just like it does, just like management fails to, or totalitarian regimes or systems of control totally fail to actually do what they try to do all the time. Anyway, there was that the idea. He basically, Paresh Chattopadhyay in that piece on Marx and bureaucracy kind of criticizes later Marxists for not really making much of what Marx has to say about bureaucracy in production and the kind of domination within production and kind of just focusing on matters of state bureaucracy. And, I think there's kind of a contradiction to an extent between, I think most people within that milieu of Leninists kind of focus heavily on the piece on authority by Engels, as opposed to focusing on the kind of subsumption and domination within production that Marx focuses on in the Critique of Political Economy. Anyway, Trotsky's usage fulfilled tactical functions as well as in its separation of the revolution proper from its Stalinist, quote, betrayal, and of Leninist organization from the state forms created under Stalin, because Trotsky believed that the Second Proletarian Revolution would sweep away Stalin and his institutional expression. Bureaucracy required no further analytical attention. Socialisme Barbarie saw this as wrong. At the conceptual level, the problem can be seen as reflecting the tendency amongst orthodox Marxists to replace the historically variable characteristics of capitalism as a mode of production with the characteristics of capitalism as a noun. This made capitalism into a temporal object shaped by essential predicates, in essence deploys in time as regularities. Such regularities comprise the underlying dynamics that shape the capitalism that Marx analyzed. Seen retrospectively, these dynamics become objective forces. Projected into the future, they become laws. Capitalism becomes immutable and its laws eternal. It is as if Marx's critique of mid-19th century bourgeois political economy had been elevated to the status of prophecy. From this followed the separation of a reality governed by these laws from the accidental. Stalin was understood as an aberration, so the consequences of his rule were epiphenomenal. Trotsky's framing of the, quote, Russian question and the understanding of Marx that was of a piece with it had been rejected by the Shulumental tendency well before they broke with the Fourth International. Following a logic to which we return later in this chapter, Socialisme ou Barbarie would come to position Marx's critical analysis of competitive capitalism as being of fundamental importance, but necessarily tied to a particular time and place. This accompanied the group's shift away from economic analysis to focus on concrete relations of production. Footnote. See below in Castoriadis' 1950-51 seminars on Marx's Capital for a more detailed presentation of the moves involved with this. This section contains the minimum information required to set up the notion of bureaucracy. End footnote. End footnote. Bureaucratic capitalism provided the frame that enabled both general characterizations of these changes as these changes appeared in post-war capitalist organization and the analysis of specific relations of contemporary industrial production. In the post-war world, bureaucracy had become a new social form, and the individual is occupying places within its parts of a new social class. For reasons that will become evident below, bureaucracy entailed fundamentally new distributions of power. The Soviet system was the most advanced expression of this new social arrangement. It presented an image of the society dominated by an apparatus that grew out of the fusion of the Bolshevik Party and the state that had been shattered by the deliberate actions of the party and recomposed around it. Racked with irrationalities and conflict, the bureaucratic apparatus used systematic terror to hold the system together. Footnote. We return to this in detail below in the context of an analysis of Castoriadis' The Relations of Production in Russia. The clearest overall image of the USSR is developed in Lafleur 1979, bracket 1956, end bracket, a remarkable analysis of the 20th Party Congress. End footnote. In Western capitalist firms, bureaucracy occupied spaces created by the separation of ownership from production. This separation followed on the creation of stock offerings as a way to address the increased capital requirements in large-scale industries. While the bureaucratization of firms began with monopoly capitalism, it only acquired its paradigmatic configuration with the development of assembly line-based production processes and the introduction of modern forms of management. Footnote. These are the defining characteristics of industrial Fordism. As this project is focused entirely on this from Chapter 3 onwards, I defer providing a detailed bibliography. For a good history of management as a social form, see Boltanski, 1982. End footnote. At the level of Western states, parallel changes in the nature and role of bureaucracy had begun in response to the Great Depression. The expansion of the state had been driven by attempts to mitigate the political and social consequences of the cyclical nature of capitalist activity. The Cold War and the institution of what Dwight Eisenhower would call, quote, the military-industrial complex, end quote, in Eisenhower's farewell speech of 1961 extended this process still further. What Paul Virilio called the, quote, pure war, end quote, of production, logistics and obsolescence as expenditure without the need for events can be understood as the perfected expression of this form of bureaucratic capitalism. Socialisme ou Barbarie defined Western, quote, state capitalism, end quote, or, quote, fragmented bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, around an American prototype. At the same time, Socialisme ou Barbarie saw Western and Soviet forms as linked by an identity at the level of relations of production. In 1949, they appeared to be pushed toward convergence by the same logic of concentration. The early phases of the Cold War made of this a potential cataclysm. The early phases of the Cold War made of this a potential cataclysm. Footnote, we return to this in more detail in the next section. For Socialisme ou Barbarie, bureaucracy was a political and analytical category simultaneously. Footnote, quote, the theory of bureaucracy is a theory of revolution, end quote, Lafleur. It intertwined with particular and general historical specificity and teleological projection. Because the category had to enable movement from characterizations of the post-war social order in general to the analysis of specific relations of production, the category was necessarily abstract. Bureaucracy was an eidos, or form. Like the results of any phenomenological investigation, this eidos was constructed from a comparative analysis geared around the isolation of commonalities. Its utility was demonstrated through the analyses it structured, which were, in turn, positioned in the context of the group's revolutionary project. But this was not itself the subject of extensive independent elaboration. The debate about Socialisme Barbarie, published in a 1957 issue of the journal Argument, distinguished the group's usage of the category from a sociology of bureaucracy. Because it was rooted in a kind of phenomenological reduction, Socialisme Barbarie's notion of bureaucracy does not account for the range of bureaucratic forms. Footnote. See the debates about Socialisme Barbarie's conceptions of bureaucracy in Argument. This list derives mostly from that of Edgar Morin's Socialisme Barbarie. I don't know if that's like a play on words or what Sol de Système. I don't know. Barbarie means. Anyway. And footnote. It neither entails nor excludes extensive analysis of administrative functions or of their internal organizations. The accounts that Socialisme Barbarie published about work in an administrative context were quite detailed, but focused on how that work was conditioned by the same kinds of separations and conflicts characteristic of relations of production in advanced industry. Socialisme Barbarie was not carrying out the sociology of bureaucracy. The group analyzed the relations of production in contemporary capitalism shaped by bureaucracy. Socialisme Barbarie's usage of the category designates a process of bureaucratization that converges on a series of separations. Footnote. On bureaucratization as a social dynamic, see Lefort, 1979, and footnote. Of these, the most important is the division of labor that separates the dirigeant from the exécutant, those who command from those who carry out these commands. The separation is repeated within bureaucratic organizations, in their hierarchical modes of operation, in the fragmentation of information, and in relations between bureaucratic systems and what lies outside of them. In the work published by Socialisme Barbarie, the central expression of this separation of the dirigeant from the exécutant unfolds on the factory floor in the context of advanced industry. In Marxian terminology, this is referred to as the point of production. The introduction of management enabled the acceleration in the development of assembly line technologies. Taken together, these constituted a wholesale transfer of creativity to management and away from workers. However, in everyday production, this transfer was revealed as an ideological desire rather than an accomplishment. This created what Socialisme Barbarie referred to as the fundamental contradiction of bureaucratic capitalism. In an assembly line-dominated, industrial Fordist context, management relations to production are mediated by process designs that stage it as flows of materials and/or components through a series of workstations. Skilled work is performed by technologies. Workers are individuated and tied to particular situations. Their roles are either to perform repetitive actions or to monitor the machinery. This relation enacts the transfer of creativity to management, both directly by way of control over the production process and indirectly by way of technological design. Workers are reduced to atomized, de-skilled extensions of the machines. But production, in fact, does not entirely correspond to production as design. Problems continually arise that require creative, often improvised action from workers. For Socialisme Barbarie, this fundamental contradiction entailed a series of confrontations. Management's top-down, individuated view of work stands against the worker collectives that organize themselves informally by shop and shift. Managerial control over production speed and outputs confronts workers' shared conception in which work is a social undertaking, the pace of which is collectively determined. The understanding of skill is built into technological and production process designs, is opposed by informal collectives within which skill is distributed in such a way as to comprise a collective attribute. The problems that arise in production and workers' responses to them fall outside managerial conceptions of the process. For Socialisme Barbarie, this meant that bureaucratic capitalism presupposed that workers are able to creatively engage with work that is organized to exclude them. Without this engagement, production would grind to a halt, but managerial approaches to production have no way to accommodate this. As a consequence, informal worker collectives are continually activated by and against the production process. These collectives, with their recognition of formal hierarchy and capacities for deliberative action centered on the bricolage of capabilities that enables the mobilization of skill as a collective attribute, comprised the everyday sources of revolutionary potential in their basic pre-political orientations. This characterization anticipates some of the types of conflict that Socialisme Barbarie will read off from the accounts of worker experience analyzed in subsequent chapters. Questions of hierarchy, control over the design and pace of work, and autonomy. To pose the separation of the dirigeant from the exécutant as the defining feature of bureaucracy is to make of it a command/control system. Control and control's correlates and predictability and efficiency are assumed in any extension of bureaucratic rationalization, but control disappears as a consequence of the bounded rationalities characteristic of bureaucratic systems. The management of a given production process is an administrative object, and the steps devised to meet that objective a means to an end. Much in the way that rules dissolve into the playing of the game they structure, control dissipates into processes or procedures. Like the rules of a game, it surfaces through problems, breakdowns, or conflicts. Consider a conflict that might erupt over the reorganization of a production process. From a viewpoint shaped by Socialisme Barbarie, this might be seen as an example of worker struggles to retain a degree of personal and professional autonomy. For an industrial sociologist, the same conflict might be seen as an example of social deviance amongst the working class. Footnote. See Castoriadis, 1988, end footnote. For management, power and exploitation dissolve into procedural rationality. Many analysts of bureaucratic systems have pointed to this systematic capacity to reduce anything to an administrative objective that can be approached through the extension of neutral procedures to the exclusion of ethical or political considerations. Footnote. Bauman, 2000, provides a particularly forceful presentation of this problem as the essential enabling condition of the Holocaust. This neutralization presupposes the combined effects of a sense of professional identification, compartmentalization both in terms of information that circulates and in terms of professional role, informal coercion and patterns of authority and information flows, parenthesis, which map one onto the other, in parenthesis, in bureaucratic systems, end footnote. In system theoretical terms, a bureaucracy is a social system that operates with an imperative to reduce complexity. Footnote. See Crises of Crisis Management, Elements of a Political Crisis Theory in OFA, 1985, and OFA, 1980. End footnote. These systems are networks of specialized and compartmentalized functions linked by information networks. To be transmitted, information has to be at once processed and fragmented in a way that fit it into the particularities of the system's organization. This would enable it to move through layers of administrative hierarchy, each of which would be a network of repetitive procedures. These networks would be differentiated not so much in kind as by status. A bureaucracy is, in a sense, a map of its environment figured in terms of regularity and predictability. Bureaucratic systems also create maps, both of themselves as systems and of the environments they administer, parenthesis, the territory, end parenthesis, that are also figured by the internal protocols of the system itself. They interact with the territory by imposing the map on the territory. But because the territory is complex and dynamic, this substitution inevitably involves gaps and irrationalities. The more such systems exclude the feedback loops which might link map to territory, the more actions of these systems tends to generate problems, often to the sides of or around the mapped spaces. For Klaus Offe, in state bureaucracies, the cycle triggers ad hoc expansions of bureaucratic systems in response to crises which arise when gaps and irrationalities pose problems for system regularities. This in turn generates a new range of crises which generate new ad hoc expansions and so on. Socialisme ou Barbarie focused on conditions at the point of production and did not frame bureaucracy as reactive in the same way. Instead, bureaucracy imposes maps of production in a rigid manner and attempts to contain the effects of gaps and irrationalities through coercion. This is of a piece with Socialisme ou Barbarie's tendency to duplicate the division of dirigeant from the exécutant with another that placed routinization on one side and creativity on another. From this followed their understanding of conflicts generated at the point of production as potentially revolutionary. They are outside of the dominant system and could not be assimilated by it. Footnote: in a 1992 with Socialisme ou Barbarie member Sebastian de Diesbach, he told me a story about writing his 1964 text, Les hiérarchies et la gestion collective. I think that's probably hierarchy and collective management, I think that translates as. Published in Socialisme ou Barbarie, numbers 37 and 38, that undercut this opposition. He explained the text by saying he had taken a job in production management. None of them had ever worked in management. They did not understand how it works. End footnote. A bureaucracy so understood would tend to eliminate the feedback loops that would enable coherent adjustments. It is impossible to imagine a bureaucratic system that entirely eliminates these loops. But it is not difficult to imagine the restriction to types of information that mirror administrative rationality back at itself. The extreme case would be that of Soviet factories during the 1930s, as described by writers like Viktor Kravchenko in I Chose Freedom, in which an entirely top-down system centered on administering plan objectives to the virtual exclusion of feedback loops in factories creates a hellish situation entirely held together by coercion and violence. At the same time, Socialisme ou Barbarie's view of the history of capitalism acknowledges the revolutionary capacities of capitalist systems to transform themselves and reshape the entire mode of production as a consequence. If this distinction between routinization and creativity were absolute, one wonders how such transformations would have been possible. The conflation of map with territory encapsulates a view of a bureaucratization that is an expression of bourgeois rationality. By conflating representation with what is represented, it reduces the world to a collection of objects. Interactions among them follow the rules of mechanical causation. These premises can be combined in a schema of unlimited rational mastery. Footnote: the theme of unlimited extension of rational mastery as a fundamental social imaginary signification, particular to capitalism, is a recurrent motif throughout Castoriadis' later work. End footnote. In the conflation of map with territory what emerges is a view of systems that are blind to themselves and only indirectly aware of the wider environments in which they operate. But this is too simplistic. Perhaps a better way to look at the operation of these systems is to revert to the distinction between the instituted and instituting. Like any social historical phenomena, bureaucratic systems are both instituting and instituted. The systems are themselves social historical creations that transform the environments with which they interact. However, the mode of operation common to them is predicated on a near absolute privileging of the instituted over the instituting. This translates into the metaphor of mapping and the substitution of a world of objects for one that is in process. In contrast, the general modality of self-organization attributed to workers' collectives is one in which the status of the instituting is at parity with the instituted. In the example provided earlier, this parity operates in the play of improvisation and constraint that is implicit in the view of skill as a collective attribute that is set into motion within specific situations. Footnote: the relation of the instituted to the instituting is one of the main questions entailed by the notion of autonomy in Castoriadis' later work. Direct democracy is posited as the collective form of self-organization that, in principle, enables the closest approximation of autonomy with respect to this relation. The qualification, quote, in principle, end quote, follows from the open-ended nature of the form, from the possibility of moving away from it via a collective decision. In other words, the fact that direct democracy enables but does guarantee autonomy at the collective level. End footnote. In fact, one does not often find the schema that shapes Socialisme Barbarie's notion of bureaucracy presented in this abstract a manner in the journal, outside the periodic synthetic presentations of the state of Socialisme Barbarie's revolutionary project, because any advantage there might be in clarity is offset by giving the impression of self-enclosure. It is more often deployed to shape specific analytical moves in specific contexts. For example, it hovers in the background of the group's assessments of economic planning. It is most extensively operative in the description and analyses of social relations and conflicts at the point of production, though it will be at the forefront of the rest of this book, and which served as fundamental points of orientation for the development of Socialisme Barbarie's revolutionary project. Quote, the relations of production in Russia. New section. The stated objective in Castoriadis' 1949 essay titled The Relations of Production in Russia, which is on this channel, is to, quote, dissolve mystifications, end quote, concerning the nature of the USSR. Taken as a whole, the text is a demolition, on Marxist grounds, of claims that the USSR was socialist. Its primary target is Trotsky. Because there was scant information about the economic conditions in the USSR, Castoriadis takes Charles Bettelheim's La Planification Soviétique as a secondary point of departure. Check out the piece that I have on this channel. The pieces I have on this channel from Charles Bettelheim. He started off as kind of like an apologist for the regime. And then becomes like a Maoist. But by the end of his career, by the time he finishes the third and fourth volumes of his class struggles in the USSR, he's definitely describing, coming to conclusions that are very similar to council communists and anarchists on the nature of the USSR. So it's a very interesting development. And in fact, if you're interested, maybe you're not, but he eventually, in that book, he cites Claude Lefort as an important secondary source on the Soviet Union and how it should be approached. So that's super interesting. But anyway, let's carry on. Footnote. There is little doubt that it was known, particularly given the assessment of the Stalinist USSR as state capitalists, but it is not referenced in this piece. Kravchenko in 1947 sold quite well, only to be followed by the, quote, Kravchenko affair. This text is cited by Castoriadis, but used with caution. Ante Siliga's The Russian Enigma is reviewed by Lefort in 1950 for Le Thème Moderne. For an indication of the change in the environment of information, compare the present conditions in the USSR below with that in the first part of Lefort in 1978. End footnote. Castoriadis regarded Bettelheim, quote, as the only person who defended Stalinism by doing something other than repeating Stalin's speeches, end quote. Castoriadis. Bettelheim's data on the distribution of income in Soviet society is reworked to demonstrate the disproportionate role of the bureaucracy and to solidify the claim that it constituted a new class formation. For our purposes, what is particularly useful about the text is the explicitness of its Marxist conceptual framework and its situating of the bureaucracy and the relations of production structured by it in a notion of social totality. Castoriadis devotes much of the piece to opposing the claim made by Trotsky and others that the capitalist characteristics that persisted in the USSR were restricted to the distribution of income. The relations of production were socialist. Footnote. Castoriadis. End footnote. In Trotsky, these claims are the correlates of the characterization of the Stalinist bureaucracy as an epiphenomenon. The initial and most basic counter is that the fusion of the party and state apparatus separated from meaningful worker management of production cannot be socialism. Rather, it is what Lenin saw as the ideal toward which monopoly capitalism was already tending in 1917. This raises the central question of how to understand relations of production. Castoriadis argues that Trotsky had been content with hand-waving in the general direction of relations of production in his interpretation of the Soviet system, without ever saying that what they were, or how they were structured. The hand-waving is of a piece with Trotsky's separation of distribution from production in order to maintain the position that the USSR was socialist insofar as production was concerned. To counter this, Castoriadis focuses on the separation itself. Castoriadis' critique is built around a series of citations from Marx's A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy to demonstrate on its own grounds the incoherence of the separation of distribution from production. They are linked aspects of a single overall structure. Quote, the conclusion which follows from this is not that production, distribution, exchange, and consumption are identical, but that they are links of a single whole, different aspects of one unit. Production is the decisive phase, both with regard to the contradictory aspects of production and with regard to the other phases. The process always starts afresh with production. That exchange and consumption cannot be the decisive element is obvious, and the same applies to distribution in the sense of distribution of products. Distribution of the factors of production, on the other hand, is itself a phase of production. A distinct mode of production thus determines the specific mode of consumption, distribution, exchange, and the specific relations of these different phases to one another. Different phases to one another. If I repeat something, that means it's in italics, if you've never watched a video of mine before. Production in the narrow sense, however, is in its turn also determined by other aspects. For example, if the market or the sphere of exchange expands, then the volume of production grows and tends to become more differentiated. Production also changes in consequence of changes in distribution, e.g. concentration of capital, different distribution of the population in town and countryside, and the like. Production is, finally, determined by the demands of consumption. There is an interaction between the various aspects. Such interaction takes place in any organic whole. End quote. Castoriadis. Material production is an aspect of an overall system, each aspect of which determines and is determined by the others. Among these, production occupies the central structuring position. It follows that, in principle, any distinction as to the character of one aspect as over and against another does not make sense. One could also say, as Castoriadis does, that making such a separation raises questions about the nature of the system as a whole. If distribution is capitalist and distribution is determined by relations of production, then the relations of production must be capitalist. Conversely, if the relations of production were socialist, then distribution would be as well. Castoriadis then demonstrates with a host of citations that this argument is not particular to Trotsky. Versions of it are repeated in many Third International analyses of the Soviet economic system to defend its socialist character and are all subject to the same critique. A few pages later, Castoriadis follows with a well-known passage from the, quote, preface to the same text, quote, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society. The real foundation. on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines men's existence, but men's social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. End quote. Marx. The base superstructure distinction is here balanced with an organic totality-style treatment of the production system. In the essay, this move sets up a critique of the juridical formalism that subtends claims regarding the political meaning of nationalization or state ownership independently of any transformation in the relations of production. The critique is extended with reference to Engels' discussion of the historical tendency of juridical forms to begin as an adequate reflection of the systems they shape and then develop into ideological expressions of the viewpoint and interests of the dominant class. These arguments all return to the centrality of relations of production, a social totality that also justifies Socialisme Barbarie's productivist orientation to come. The passages taken from Marx are statements about the interdependence of the phases of material reproduction. They do not refer to dynamics that might shape the behavior of these relations across time. The conception of interdependency and hierarchies among them shapes most of the analyses Socialisme Barbarie produced across the period covered in this book. Castoriadis argues that this formulation from Marx should be taken literally. Quote, "The lesson of this text is clear. The relations of production are concrete social relations of man with man, of class with class, as they are realized in the constant daily production and reproduction of material life." End quote. Castoriadis. This points to a break with the tendency in Marxian writing to treat the working class as a generality that responds to and reflects the arrangement of objective forces. Fleshing out the implications of this position becomes a central preoccupation for the group after 1953. At every point, the analysis of the relations of production is frame contingent. Later in the essay, Castoriadis provides a definition of the relations of production that enables a clear distinction between the relations of production's capitalist and socialist versions. 1. Relations of production in general are defined by the mode of managing production, organization and cooperation of the personal and material goals of production, definition of the goals and methods, and by the mode of distributing the social product, 2. The class content of the relations of production is founded upon the initial distribution of the conditions of production, monopolization of the means of production by a particular class, constant reproduction of this monopolization, and is manifested in the dominant class's management of production and in the distribution of social product in its favor. 3. From the point of view of the exploited class, the class content is manifested through its reduction to the narrow role of executants and, more generally, through its human alienation and total subordination to the dominant class, End quote. Castoriadis. The first point uses direct control over the management and setting of objectives to distinguish capitalist relations of production from socialist relations of production. The other two distinguish between dirigeant and the executant to characterize the relations specific to capitalism. Castoriadis then reverts to the description of competitive capitalism drawn from Marx. In capitalist relations of production, the fundamental relation is that of the employer to worker. The employer controls the conditions of production. The worker sells his or her labor power for a wage. Ownership of the means of production includes that of the physical space and the technologies, both of which are past or dead labor. Ownership extends to control over the organization of production and the setting of objectives. Workers who sell their labor power in this context find themselves locked into a situation predicated on exploitation and alienation. Quote, in conclusion, the inherent exploitation of the capitalist system is based on the fact that the producers do not have the means of production at their disposal, either individually, artisanal, or collectively, socialism, and that living labor, instead of dominating dead labor, is dominated by it, through the intermediary of the individuals who personify it, capitalists, The relations of production are relations of exploitation under both their aspects, qua the organization of production properly so called, and qua the organization of distribution. Living labor is subordinated to dead labor in production proper, since living labor's viewpoint is subordinated to that of dead labor, and is completely subordinated to dead labor. In the organization of production, the proletariat is entirely dominated by capital, and only exists for capital. The proletariat is also exploited in the process of distribution, since his sharing in the social product is governed by economic laws, expressed by the employer on the level of consciousness, that define his participation not on the basis of the value created through the power of labor, but on the value of this labor power. These laws, which express the profound tendency of capital accumulation, bring the cost of producing labor power more and more down to a physical minimum, ... Unquote, Castoriadis. To understand the relations of production requires an account of the circuits within which they operate. As noted earlier, what determines the immediate circuit is control or management, the setting of overall objectives that shape the nature of production. Workers who sell their labor power enter into that system. At a more general level, material conditions and social arrangements converge, and are driven by the dynamics and organic crises of capital. For example, insofar as workers are concerned, the falling rate of profit plays out as the ratcheting up of the intensity of exploitation and a diminishing of returns. The polemical character of the text pins its argument to a fidelity to Marx. This makes it difficult to say whether Castoriadis saw the organic crises of capital and the increasing immiseration of the proletariat as operative on a deep structural level in the capitalism of 1949. When Castoriadis notes that bureaucratic capitalism tends towards a negation of the laws of competitive capitalism, Castoriadis refers primarily to the elimination of otherwise, quote, natural limits on exploitation in Russia. But given the role played by categories like the concentration of capital in other texts of this period, it is reasonable to conclude that Castoriadis did. This point serves to emphasize the importance of the shifts that Socialisme Barbarie was to make over the next 2 years. The brief outline of the relations of production under socialism that follows is interesting in its generality. Worker management of production at both the macro and micro levels would necessarily entail basic transformations in the way production is organized and carried out. But compared with what Socialisme Barbarie would later stipulate about the content of socialism, it is perfunctory, serving as a counterexample. The main argument proceeds from the relatively detailed outline of conditions under competitive capitalism to an outline of relations of production under Soviet-style bureaucratic capitalism. The scenario is largely the same, except that it is now the bureaucracy that occupies the situation of the capitalists. The party bureaucracy now monopolizes the means of production and the determination of its organization and goals. It controls consumption. It has abolished labor markets. Because the Soviet system saw itself as a workers' state, there was no need for unions or the right to strike. By 1940, even the ability to leave one's job had been removed. The basic relations of production are those of advanced capitalist industry. What differentiates them is that any limits on the exploitation of workers present in the West have been eliminated. Castoriadis notes evidence of worker resistance to the specifically engineered hell. From a revolutionary viewpoint, however, this resistance is aleatory, limited to pilferage or a sort of, quote, active indifference, end quote. Dominated by a brutal bureaucratic capitalist order, and without hope of relief or organization, Soviet workers were in a horrific position, one that, quote, if not offered another way out, ... cannot but bring this class's political and social degradation, end quote. But the suffocation of the workers was also that of the apparatus. Following on the logic of the fundamental contradiction of bureaucratic capitalism, the system as a whole should tend toward collapse. In this context, the plan serves to construct and legitimate this form of exploitation and is itself an ideological document. Because Bettelheim's analysis accepted its premises, it could not help but be an apology for it. It is with some glee, then, that Castoriadis uses it to demonstrate that the apparatus expropriates a significant percentage of what it was understood to be distributing. This is taken as a demonstration of its status as a new type of class formation. Footnote. See Castoriadis 1949b for Castoriadis' critique of Bettelheim's use of this data as a springboard for an apology for the bureaucratic capitalist order and as an anchor for arbitrary modeling assumptions, for example, in the positing of a viable labor market. End footnote. The article, The Relations of Production in Russia, is an intricate combination of innovation that also enacts a relation to inherited conceptual frames consistent with heretical argumentation within an operative field of cultural production. The assumption behind Bourdieu's model is that, despite whatever might be articulated at the level of content, positions within a given field compete for the cultural power that follows from domination, which lay with the ability to structure the reception of cultural objects and by extension to impose one's textual canon and interpretive protocols. By extension, breaking with a given field is still a move in the same game. Were this to be universally the case, a consequence would be conservatism with respect to tradition or the canonical materials that comprise its center, that would often be at cross purposes with the claims that might be made using those materials. The handling of Marx and Lenin in the article, The Relations of Production in Russia, can be read through this lens. It positions the text within the breakaway from Trotskyism. At roughly the same time, however, Socialisme Barbarie was distancing itself from that context and had initiated an informal process internally so as to enact quite different relations to the canon and enable continued development outside of the previous frame of reference. New section. On Lenin. Between November 1949 and July 1950, Socialisme Barbarie held 16 meetings devoted to reading Lenin. These were, quote, not educational meetings in the traditional sense, but much more research meetings, end quote. They were attended by a group of perhaps 10 to 15 people. The participants included 4 or 5 members of Socialisme Barbarie, along with others from La Gauche Communiste de France, a successor to the Trotskyist Courant Communiste Internationaliste, which Lefort had been part of during World War II. La Gauche Communiste de France held itself at a remove from the Parti Communiste Internationaliste and was linked to Socialisme Barbarie by personal friendships. Footnote. Leaving aside the peculiar pattern in French Trotskyist circles in 2012 of resurrecting group names from the past, there seems to be a new CCI. End footnote. They were later joined by people from the Bourdieuist Internationaliste group. The La Gauche Communiste de France contingent did not remain. The people from the Internationaliste did. Participants were given a reading list in advance. Each meeting began with a presentation by Castoriadis. Some of these were prepared, others were extemporized from notes. Each was followed by a series of semi-formal interventions. These were transcribed. The more open discussion which followed was not. The presses published in Socialisme Barbarie 5-6 summarized the goals of the series. Quote, the need to study Lenin's work derives, first of all, from the need of the avant-garde to submit its heritage from the past to critical examination. The confusion that currently reigns between Leninism and Stalinism renders this all the more imperative. The fact is that Leninism was the first attempt at a complete response to all the programmatic questions that posed themselves to the revolutionary movement. Lenin was the first to place himself at the level of world revolutionary strategy and tactics. Lenin's actions had, from one end to the other, an exemplary character not realized before or since. All this shows that there is no possible elaboration of a revolutionary program without a clear balance sheet on Leninism. End quote. Footnote. I have transcripts of these lectures from Castoriadis' archive. Unfortunately, the set is incomplete. For the present discussion, That the section on imperialism is missing is particularly unfortunate. End footnote. Chalut-Montal had done similar collective readings, but the lack of documented traces makes it difficult to know how they proceeded. Footnote, but see, for example, the short pieces on Hegel's logic published by Castoriadis, or those on the Russian question included in Castoriadis 1988. End footnote. In these meetings, Socialisme Barbarie was turned to the central... In these central meetings, Socialisme Barbarie was turning to the central text of the tradition in order to alter the group's collective relations to that tradition. Castoriadis' introduction to the series makes this quite clear. Quote, why study Lenin? It is a matter of knowing whether there is a continuity in the workers' movement and what that continuity is and our attitude with respect to that continuity. We have to have the courage to get to the bottom of the question and ask, is the weight of the past in the minds of new militants useful or damaging? Perhaps the primary task is a relentless struggle against this famous, quote, tradition, in the name of which the worst stupidities are maintained despite all appearances and the worst betrayals are committed. Undoubtedly it is. There is an entire side of the tradition of the workers' movement that weighs very heavily on contemporary proletarian consciousness. And there is an entire host of zombies in worker organizations that justify their status as mouthpieces by referring to this, quote, tradition. One can never do enough to liquidate that tradition, but we must liquidate it rationally in the light of a critical examination and a serious analysis of its content and of the context that shaped it. To say that the revolutionary movement must completely liquidate its past presupposes that it knows that past. End quote. Castoriadis, Presentations on Lenin, 1949 to 1950. End footnote. The introduction goes on to provide tactical justification for turning to Lenin. The ubiquity of reference to Lenin's work makes an assessment unavoidable, etc. Footnote. Quote, like it or not, ... the great majority of worker militants align themselves consciously with Marxism in its most advanced form of practice, Leninism. This is true whether one is talking about worker militants under the influence of Stalinism, which endlessly exploits the linkage of the linkage of Leninism to Marxism, or anti-Stalinist militants. It is impossible to link a contemporary conception of revolutionary ideology and revolutionary program without clarification of the question of Leninism. This task is all the more urgent given the degeneration of the Bolshevik Party and the historically unprecedented equivocation created by the Third International between Leninism and bureaucracy. For some, the fact that Stalinism issued from Leninism constitutes its justification, while for others, this same fact is only the objective demonstration of the bureaucratic character of Leninism. End quote. Castoriadis. End footnote. The central objective was to move beyond acts of, quote, demystification that would in theory open up the works of Lenin, Marx, and Engels in ways that exceed and run counter to their dominant usages. Remaining within these usages would be to treat the works as static and the tradition of which they are part as a closed circuit. Such a move would reduce militant action to textual interpretation. It would place them in a position not unlike writers in contemporary academia who make radical claims with respect to a rationality that they appeal to through their style of explanation, and in so doing place the rationality outside the space of critique. The neutral space that situates the reader of such text is enacted and legitimated through the text interpretive procedures, even as the content of the critique would undermine it. The past and its repetition are like dead weight on the present. One is reduced to substituting the sense of movement that can follow from reanimations and rearrangement of aspects of that past for political action in the present. The program outlined above would liquidate this whole conception of tradition and the relations to it that are typically enacted more often than conceptualized. Footnote. Liquidation used in this manner was Trotskyist slang. End footnote. The justification for doing so is an argument from consequences, but this does not entail the simple rejection of the Marxian tradition or of the history from which it derives and which is in turn articulated through it. Quote, because Leninism is a viewpoint that extends to almost all the problems that the revolutionary movement confronts, these questions are absolutely vital for the proletariat, such as the question of the development of proletarian consciousness, of the party, of the nature of revolution in a developing country, the national question, the nature of imperialism and the response to imperialist war, the nature of the state, of the bourgeois republic and the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular, the role of unions under capitalism and under worker control, etc. Can we simply throw out the Leninist approaches to these matters? Of course not. End quote. Castoriadis, Presentations on Lenin. The elaboration which follows is here quoted at length. Quote, in other words, a critical appraisal of Lenin poses the more pressing contemporary problems that confront the workers' movement with respect to the revolutionary program and workers' power. On this, allow me to say a few words about the utility of this work for our group. What distinguishes us from the other left groups that are close to us, that is, which position themselves in uncompromising struggle against capitalism, bourgeois or bureaucratic, is not the intense desire that we want to show regarding the construction of the theoretical foundations for a revolutionary program, nor even our orientation toward the construction of an effective revolutionary leadership. On those points, everyone agrees, if not in acts, then at least in words. What distinguishes us is that we consider the clarification of revolutionary theory to be in vain, and the construction of a revolutionary direction impossible without the most detailed possible definition in the present conditions of the revolutionary program. The elaboration of this program passes through the analysis of Leninism. The Leninist approach is the only programmatic approach to this day to be coherent, systematic, and universal as a whole. These reasons are for us central. But there are many other reasons that justify taking up Leninism as an object of study. Leninism enables us to study an entire developmental arc, from the constitution of the Bolshevik Party and its struggles, to the Bolshevik Party's seizure of power, the responses it gave to problems encountered once it had power, and its final degeneration. The party was incontestably revolutionary and proletarian from its introduction of Marxism into a quasi-feudal country. It was brought to power by the most grandiose revolution in history and ended with the instauration of the most modern regime of exploitation. Its development transcended the limits of a national phenomenon to embrace the global workers' movement, not only by its consequences but intellectually. The Third International was founded on Leninist principles and was the first and last real international to this day. Finally, we study Leninism because it is, only through it, that one sees the development of practice linked so intimately to the development of theory. The Bolshevik Party was the only one that gave no answer to urgent practical questions without a deep theoretical examination that was not shaped by a desire to harmonize reality with their ideas or their theoretical viewpoints with slogans. To use a literary expression, it is with Leninism that the revolutionary movement reached its classical period, the phase during which the development of theory and practice went harmoniously together and were crowned with results at once magnificent and terrible. End quote. Castoriadis. Footnote. Castoriadis, Presentation on Lenin, 1949 to 1950. Or Presentations on Lenin, plural, 1949 to 1950. End footnote. The series will understand Lenin as a kind of template for revolutionaries in his range of engagements and commitments and close, consistent relationship between theory and practice. The approach to reading Lenin will be historicizing as well. It broaches the question of the party in terms shaped by theoretical justifications and their historical outcomes, both those which were intended and those which were not. The idea is to influence the development of a revolutionary program that accommodates the situation of workers in contemporary capitalism in a project framed by a vision of socialism that orients it towards the future. The goal is to extract a schema from Lenin that would shape Socialisme Barbarie's collective militant practices. This scheme would direct the processes of making certain modes of interaction or procedures, the tight linking of theory and practice, an openness of conceptual frames to new forms of social being, continuous interrogation, tireless work. It would take as given the international viewpoint that Leninism played a fundamental role in fashioning, but it would contextualize and so be distanced from the particular choices made by Lenin himself. For example, this engagement with Lenin will again pose the question of revolutionary organization and the critique of the vanguard party and the implications of that critique for the group itself. In other words, the revolutionary footnote. In other words, the revolutionary organization would not itself perform revolutionary actions as would a cadre of professional revolutionaries that operate in the name of the working class. Ideally, it would work in a symbiotic relationship with the worker avant-garde as an aspect of an overarching revolutionary process in which the organization would attempt to provide interpretations and clarity, and the workers would be the primary actors. End footnote. Framed in this way, the schema is neither imitation nor repetition. Rather, it is a mode of structuring an open-ended activity. If one takes this literally, as suggesting an approach to the redirection of a working process, it would require the internalization through repetition in time before the schema would disappear into the practices it structured. Perhaps this contributes to explaining the lag that separated such internal statements about leadership from changes in the writing that appeared in Socialisme Barbarie. The approach to Lenin that Castoriadis outlines was informed fundamentally by the differences in historical situation. From 1949, the arcs that were in the making for Lenin had become apparent, and the consequences of choices that may have been forced by contingent factors had become manifest. This relation to ex post facto historical outcomes enables a derivation of quote, meaning or direction. The derivation of sense and implication from the past is an exercise in reading off patterns from the present. A shuttling back and forth between the two could shape ways of being revolutionary, operative, outside the system of constraint and reinforcement particular to the field of cultural production Socialisme Barbarie had left behind. The reading of history was central to this operation. Like any such reading of history, the group's reading would rest on certain assumptions. Castoriadis makes some of them explicit at the end of the typescript. Quote, "For us, there is no serious analysis of history of the workers' movement, nor is there any revolutionary perspective outside the following principles. 1. Each phase of the workers' movement is an expression of a phase of the economic development of capitalist society and of the proletariat itself as the essential productive force of modern society. 2. Each phase of the workers' movement also corresponds to a phase of social development in general, in particular to the collapse or reorganization of the social groups most closely linked to production and to social life in general that is closest to the proletariat. 3. Each phase of the development of the workers' movement is an expression of a step in the development of class consciousness, a new objective experience which poses new tasks for the proletariat across the successes and failures of the movement, and at the same time gives them the objectives that enable them to resolve its problems at the level of consciousness and reality." End quote. Castoriadis, Presentations on Lenin. These assumptions frame Lenin, (ism), as an expression of a particular phase of development in the history of the workers' movement. By foregrounding the relations of the party to forces beyond itself, the approach has Socialisme Barbarie's critique of the vanguard party built into it. This analytical unit, quote, "party workers," end quote, is then contextualized by fitting it into an image of the social totality outlined earlier with respect to Marx. This notion of social totality would allow the phase in the history of the workers' movement, expressed in the relation of the party, to be integrated into a network of determinations that would refer it to the concrete relations of production that obtained at the time. The operation could then be reversed, moving from concrete relations of production outward to forms of revolutionary action. The final step would position these analytical outcomes in the context of a progressive narrative that charts the unfolding of the proletarian revolutionary project. These steps rehearse as a historical method the approach to autonomous workers' actions the group will take after Stalin's death. Unfortunately, these seminars survive as a very incomplete series. What remains is comprised largely of handwritten notes and transcripts of discussions. The discussions are interesting due to their range of responses. Each group that attended had read the material and was already familiar with the context out of which the text arose. They are debates on points of interpretation or the political utility of a given move in Castoriadis' presentations. The general character of the discussion shows that there is no sense in which these meetings resolved problems or represented a definitive step in any particular direction. There was no, quote, okay, now that that's been sorted, ... end quote. Rather, there were interpretations that posed questions and initiated or inflected ongoing conversations. There were also, as I argued earlier, aspects of a process centered on developing practical ways to move forward as a revolutionary group outside the milieu of Trotskyism. Second. New section. The logic of concentration in the Cold War. While the reading circle devoted to Lenin was moving through the tradition at one rhythm, the writing and collective editing of articles for publication in the journal moved at another. The articles that appeared in the journal devoted to the international situation from 1949 to 1950 make extensive use of Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, by Lenin, to describe the general dynamic underpinning interblock conflict. The record of the meeting devoted to Lenin's pamphlet on imperialism does not survive, but imperialism is the first on a list of major themes to be addressed. In the Capital, Marx's Capital, seminars of the following year, Castoriadis frames Lenin's text as, quote, a description of monopoly capitalism, end quote, and not a theory in the sense that Marx had developed for competitive capitalism. In the text on the international situation, however, the overarching tendency that drives events is concentration. For Lenin, the process of concentration drove the transition from market to monopoly capitalism. Quote, if it were necessary to give the briefest possible definition of imperialism, we should have to say that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. Such a definition would include what is most important. For on the one hand, finance capital is the bank capital of a very few big monopolist banks, merged with the capital of monopolist associations of industrialists. And, on the other, the division of the world is the transition from a colonial policy which is extended without hindrance to territories not seized by any capitalist power, to a colonial policy of monopolist possession of the entire globe, which has been completely divided up, end quote. Lenin then goes to enumerate 5 more basic features of imperialism. Quote, 1. The concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. 2. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital, and the creation, on the basis of this, quote, finance capital, end quote, of a financial oligarchy. 3. The export of capital is distinguished from the export of commodities, acquires exceptional importance. 4. Formation of international monopolist associations which share the world amongst themselves. And 5. The territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers, end quote. Lenin. Socialisme of Barbarie took Lenin's account to be an accurate description of the underlying processes that drove the evolution of monopoly capitalism. Imperialism remained a significant aspect of bureaucratic capitalism as an overall social form, in which it was both an expression of the tendency to concentration and a force that was driving that tendency. Quote, the analysis of the contemporary world situation, presented in this review since its first issue, can be summarized as follows. The fundamental characteristic of the contemporary period is the struggle between the American and Russian blocs for the domination and exploitation of the world. This struggle finds its source in the inexorable necessity that pushes the dominant class in each bloc. The American trust in the Russian bureaucracy to increase its profits and power, to assure the exploitation of all humanity, to secure its domination against all external attack and internal uprising. Since there is little chance that the proletariat can, by a revolution that would head off war, return the exploitative regimes of the East and West, it is more than likely that the struggle between the two blocs will culminate in a Third World War, end quote. Castoriadis, 1954. The early phase of the Cold War was a repetition of the logic of imperialism at a higher level of generality. However, the group rejected the dialectical framework within which Lenin placed his description. So long, the overall situation So while the overall situation could be seen as moving along a single overarching logic, a closer look, as appears in Castoriadis' 1949 essay, La consolidation temporaire du capitalisme mondial, revealed a more heterodox situation. My guessing of the name of that essay is titled The Temporary Consolidation of World Capitalism. That's what I'm guessing that means. Quote, A. The year 1948 has demonstrated, on the one hand, the impossibility of any lasting compromise between the American and Russian blocs. On the other hand, it confirmed the division of the world into two closed zones within which the system of exploitation has achieved its relative consolidation in the short term. B. It now appears the absolute confirmation of the inevitability of war cannot be derived from a uniform process leading to total and overt conflict. On the contrary, a phase is now opened of compartmentalization with the localized containment of conflict points. Some conflicts may even be eliminated, end quote. Castoriadis. Footnote. This is part of a summary of 2 lectures given by Castoriadis at Socialisme ou Barbarie meetings in February 1949. End footnote. The abstract tendency toward interblock war, driven by the logic of capital concentration, translated directly into events at every period. Castoriadis argued that war remained, quote, unavoidable, even though interblock confrontation had entered a phase of compartmentalization and localization of conflict. Any consolidation of position was temporary. Cracks beneath the surface would eventually undermine the stability. The result would be acceleration toward war. These cracks ran along the spaces described in Trotsky's notion of uneven development. The unevenness of economic expansion in 1949 was evident in a number of indices. Castoriadis used OEC data on 1948 to 49 rates of overall economic expansion and their different rates of diminution by sector, the spatial unevenness of development, and the reduction of international relative to domestic exchange to argue that aggregate expansion masked deep structural problems. These indices were not secret, and Castoriadis' interpretation of them eccentric. These indices were not secret, and Castoriadis' interpretation of these indices not eccentric. The U.S. had used the same data, recognized signs of trouble, and tried to respond through the Marshall Plan. Socialisme ou Barbarie read the Marshall Plan as an American effort to address the unevenness of development by aligning the weakened European economies with its own through exchange mechanisms and trade agreements in which European countries were in no position to participate. American planners soon recognized the gap that separated the plan from reality and responded by setting goals for European economic development over the period 1949 to 52. These goals would have been totally unrealistic even if Congress had funded them. For Socialisme ou Barbarie, these difficulties indicated that the Marshall Plan was affected by the same problems as other more totalizing state plans, premised on inaccurate feedback and incapable of creating mechanisms to compensate for it. The Marshall Plan was elaborated entirely on the basis of projections more reflective of bureaucratic system goals and internal criteria than of the environment it was designed to regulate. Castoriadis concluded that the Marshall Plan could not be more than a temporary palliative. Its limits were already becoming apparent during the first economic quarter of 1949 in signs of an American overproduction crisis and depression. Still in this respect, working out of a standard Marxist framework, Castoriadis saw in overproduction evidence of the failure of American efforts at system stabilization. The only other mechanism available to assure system cohesion was war. Therefore, Castoriadis argued, barring revolution, the failure of the Marshall Plan to counter uneven economic development, and the political crises caused by it, would push Western bureaucratic capitalism into an all-out war against the Soviet-dominated bloc, and this sooner rather than later. Footnote. This summary does not do justice to the complexity of explanations offered for the permanent crisis of decadent Western capitalism, all of which are ultimately traceable back to the nature of monopoly and bureaucratic capitalism suggested earlier. The suppression of markets, the artificiality of prices in a monopoly environment, the use of highly rationalized production techniques as a means of cutting costs, which also had the effect of rendering overall production increasingly irrational, etc. End footnote. The Korean War seemed to confirm Socialisme Barbarie's darkest prognostications. Socialisme Barbarie viewed the Korean War as resulting from Western failure to stabilize their economies, and as the inevitable outcome of American strategy of, quote, Cold War. This strategy involved the demobilization of the World War II armed forces as an official acknowledgement of peace. For Socialisme Barbarie, demobilization was a, quote, calculated risk, end quote, designed to buy time adequate for an upgrade of military hardware and strategy in anticipation of nuclear war. The Korean War crumbled this facade of peace and pushed Socialisme Barbarie to the following conclusion, quote, the Korean War is, in its form, a civil war in the context of a backward country struggling for its national independence. But this is a form, the content of which is entirely empty, The theory of a struggle for, quote, national independence, end quote, is, in this case, the exact homology, in workers' terminology, of the theory of the, quote, police operation, end quote, in bourgeois terminology. In reality, the fact that tiny North Korea and the immense USA have only played such a small role up to now cannot be explained if the former was not behind the scenes under the power and tight control of Russia. End quote. Socialisme Barbarie. Given the model outlined earlier, this local conflict by proxy between the imperial powers appeared to be the incident that would lead to global war. The revolutionary intervention of the proletariat represented the only way to disrupt this logic. But Cold War political polarization had eliminated any prospect that working class revolution would originate in either bloc. Socialisme Barbarie analyzed the alienation of French workers from trade unions and political parties as a result of their every action having been forced into an international political frame. Worker disaffection combined with trade union polarization to prevent any coherent action from taking shape that could have addressed stagnant wages, higher prices, and demands for, quote, wartime production increases. The French workers were standing by, alienated from politics, unable to envision the future, waiting to see what happened. Socialisme Barbarie saw the plight of French workers as emblematic of workers generally. Given this passivity, Socialisme Barbarie could do little more than describe what they argued was the withdrawal of the working class from politics and conclude on that basis that at that moment there was no organization capable of stepping in to shift politics or theory onto revolutionary ground. This is the onset of modern barbarism. Quote, we can, define these two notions. The decadence of the capitalist regime is the period during which the latter enters into a state of permanent crisis, even as it continues to develop the material and human preconditions of a superior order. In other words, even as it continues to develop the premises of socialist revolution. In contrast, the decomposition of this system would begin at the moment when the objective possibilities for the creation of a superior social order disappear, This precisely is the possibility of modern barbarism, no longer as a tendency developing constantly within exploiting society, but as a phase of social decomposition, during which the forces of production, as well as revolutionary class consciousness, undergo profound and lasting regression. Modern barbarism would be the historical period in which the possibility of revolutionary communism would be absent. End quote. Castoriadis. However, the Korean War did not result in a Third World War. In late 1952, Socialisme Barbarie published an article that acknowledged their obvious error in the overstatement of the importance of imperialism and the concentration of capital in their analysis of interbloc conflict. The consequences of this error were a, quote, the sky is falling, end quote, reading of Korea, and an overestimation of the Western Bloc's coherence. Socialisme Barbarie explained the latter problem of the actual incoherence of the Western Bloc by arguing that American domination, quote, lacked a social base, end quote. Socialisme Barbarie. In other words, the Americans controlled the Western Bloc because the Americans were in a materially advantageous position after World War II that enabled the Americans to forcibly assume a leadership role. The bloc was a creation of force that was held together by force. Socialisme Barbarie argued that the lack of a social base was reflected in the basic instability of the American position. Squabbling between the Allies over matters of strategy was evidence of this instability. American leadership exercised through political pressure was therefore an artificial superstructural phenomenon. It was not an expression of the contradictions that structured relations between, quote, social forces, which have made it, quote, organic. Socialisme Barbarie developed this, quote, disunity thesis, end quote, in order to explain why World War had not happened. It was a rather strange explanation that enabled Socialisme Barbarie to move on without drawing any conclusions. Footnote. The unsigned editorial, La Situation Internationale, in Socialisme Barbarie, number 11, November to December 1952. New section, the Capital Seminars. Beginning in November 1950 and continuing through June 1951, Socialisme Barbarie held a second series of meetings focused on canonical materials. These took the form of lectures on Marx's Capital that Castoriadis delivered at the Centre d'études économiques, part of the 6th division of l'École pratique des hautes études, I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of this right, which later became l'École des hautes études en sciences sociales. These seminar-length lectures were typed out in their entirety. The series of 16 moves from a general introduction through an overview of Marxian and bourgeois political economy to a close reading of substantial portions of Capital. They are too complex to be summarized here and would be good candidates for separate publication. This section concentrates on the final 4 lectures, which attempt to, quote, disengage a philosophical schema, end quote, that shaped Marx's work on competitive capitalism and use it to determine whether a comparable theory could be constructed to account for the overall dynamics that shape monopoly or bureaucratic capitalism. The starting point for this segment of the series is, there is no theory of monopoly or monopoly capitalism in Marx. There are suggestions of how Marx might have proceeded with the project in Capital Volume 3. But they are no more than suggestions. The question is how one would go about constructing such a theory. The obvious move would be to use a theoretical schema drawn from Capital itself. In Castoriadis' view, the abstraction of that schema opens onto a methodological question concerning the conditions under which an analysis of a specific economic form can proceed from the particular to the general. This would enable the passage from description to theory. This question is vexing if one is not content with the production of the sort of metaphysical models favored by bourgeois economists that substitute for social reality. Castoriadis argues that the main advantage that Marx brings to the critique of bourgeois political economy was that his theory of competitive capitalism as a social system accounted for significant aspects of social reality because it placed the analytical and political questions of class in the foreground. Any parallel theoretical account of monopoly or bureaucratic capitalism would have to do the same. Castoriadis argues that, for Marx, the conditions of possibility for the movement from the particular to the general fundamental to capital, Marx's Capital, followed from the singularly advantageous context in which he worked. Competitive capitalism enabled the assumption that a single firm centered on a single process produced a single commodity. The value under a price of that commodity was a social function because of the roles played by markets. This made of it a discrete system with more or less standard analytical units, the actions of which were at once individual and social, and that operated as a system with regularities that Marx was able to point out. But the center of the analysis was not the description of these regularities, but their consequences for workers. For Castoriadis, while the model Marx constructed of competitive capitalism involved simplifications and operated at considerable remove from economic realities, the political core of his analysis was so important that these limitations were secondary problems. The model worked out some of the regularities that the system produced through its functioning in general, and which could be seen as conditioning it in turn, and then linked them to the questions of wage labor and exploitation. The evolution of competitive capitalism was driven by tendencies to concentrate both at the levels of capital and the organization of production, through its horizontal and vertical integrations, concentration, particularly in the organization of production, destroyed the laws that enabled its evolution by undermining the assumptions concerning the nature of firms that enabled Marx to generalize. Further, the tendency to concentrate did not result in a single type of productive unit that supplanted the type upon which Marx relied. Not all economic sectors concentrated in the same ways. Even within the sectors furthest advanced in these terms, the outcome was not uniform. Monopoly is a theoretical construct. The complete domination of a given sector of production by a single firm is a limit state. Those sectors characterized by intensive concentration are typically oligopolies, small numbers of firms which operate within national boundaries as de facto cartels, particularly insofar as raw materials are concerned. Monopoly would enable the simplifications required for system modeling. Oligopolies do not. Marxian theories of monopoly had in the main treated it as the aggregation of individual productive units. Seeing monopoly as a combinatorial phenomenon would enable its disaggregation. This allowed orthodox analysts to claim that the same general laws Marx pointed to in Capital continued to function. Castoriadis argues that concentration results in both quantitative and qualitative changes in organization. To demonstrate what is meant by qualitative change, Castoriadis turns to a series of bourgeois economists, reproaching them in the manner of Marx as objects of critique and reappropriation. Monopoly is not merely the aggregation of small productive units. Monopoly is also the elimination of markets in their competitive capitalist forms. This basically transforms the nature of value or price. Value is no longer a social function in the same way as it had been for Marx. On the one hand, loosely following Hayek, one could imagine a monopoly that set prices entirely on the basis of internal bureaucratic criteria. This would make it arbitrary with respect to external factors, but comprehensible in terms of power arrangements within the bureaucracy itself. Hayek had argued that, because firms are not transparent to themselves, the history of price is the main index that firms can appeal to in order to assess their own performance. This makes of the history of price the basis for rational activity. Castoriadis mirrors this understanding of bureaucratic system operation as tending toward irrationality by the elimination of feedback. A second possibility is to see monopoly pricing as based on assessments of demand elasticity. In this case, the monopoly would be oriented toward a space external to itself, but would only derive from demand elasticity information about its immediate context, conditions local to primary materials or the activities of production units integrated within a larger chain, or local to the context in which commodities were offered. In both cases, value has changed from a broadly social function to a description of particular states of affairs. Castoriadis argues that while every particular situation would be amenable to a description, exhaustive description would not be possible. Even if exhaustive description of a particular situation were in principle to be generated, nothing would enable the passage from the particular, either temporally or spatially. By the removal of the kinds of social relations that underpinned value in competitive capitalism, monopoly capitalism undercut the basis for movement from the particular to the general that would enable an analysis comparable to what finds in Marx. The same analytical problems repeat in contexts characterized by the progressive fusion of highly concentrated firms with the state and bureaucratic capitalist contexts, although in different ways. This is not to say that oligopoly behavior is therefore incomprehensible. Rather, the conclusion is that comprehending their activities is primarily a sociological question. The main Marxian analyses of monopoly capitalism, including Lenin's pamphlet on imperialism, are relegated to the status of descriptions. Footnote. Again, because the session on imperialism from the meetings on Lenin is missing, it is difficult to know whether this conclusion was already present there or if it is something new with these seminars. End footnote. Where am I? Where's that footnote? The problem of generalizing on the basis of any series of descriptions of different situations recapitulates that of an exhaustive knowledge of each situation. In other words, once one moves out of competitive capitalism, the primacy of economic analysis is undercut. The same gesture historicizes the economic analysis of competitive capitalism. Economics operates on the same plane as other forms of social analysis do. Its utility is determined situationally. That utility would be shaped by the ability of a particular analysis to eliminate the situation of the workers politically. As was the case with the meetings devoted to Lenin, the implications of these seminars are not immediately apparent in the text published by the group. But they do clear the way for the turn in Socialisme or Barbarie's collective focus on forms of autonomous worker action and their modes of self-organization after the death of Stalin in 1953. From there, Socialisme or Barbarie begins to look to council forms as a way of thinking about worker self-organization and of linking them back to accounts of everyday experience at the factory floor in order to complete the circuit of situating councils as an expression of conflicts in contemporary relations of production. It is at this point that the fundamental contradiction of bureaucratic capitalism moves to the fore as a structuring heuristic. New section. Where things stop. Socialisme ou Barbarie's apocalyptical view of the Korean War coincided with their most difficult period as a group. The delimited field of ideological production from which Socialisme ou Barbarie had emerged was collapsing. The Fourth International imploded in 1952, the most visible effect of the Cold War's political polarization and its elimination of space from which revolutionary dissent might be articulated. The Communist Party of France's, quote, revolutionary posture co-opted much of its language. In France, Socialisme ou Barbarie was virtually alone in opposing the French Communist Party on Marxist grounds, and behind it the USSR. But the journal no longer sold much beyond the confines of the group. Claude Lefort later characterized this period as the group's, quote, desert crossing, end quote, of the, quote, long night of Stalinism, end quote. Claude Lefort. The period, quote, cannot be imagined by anyone who is not there, end quote. Lefort. Between 1950 and 1953, the group moved into new theoretical territory away from Trotskyism. Between 1950 and 1953, the group moved into new theoretical territory and away from Trotskyism and the preoccupations of its militants. The indices of the growing distance that separated Socialisme ou Barbarie from Trotskyism included the group's position on the USSR, its insistence on a close analysis of contemporary capitalism without regard for the past, its insistence on theoretical innovation to accommodate the emergence of new types of political action, its attitude towards the major figures in the history of Marxism, and the increasingly philosophical character of its main texts. These same developments prompted several militants to leave the group, many of whom had followed the group out of the Parti Communiste Internationaliste. A particularly difficult loss was that of psychoanalyst Jean Laplanche, who had been important for political and financial reasons during this period. Raoul was a PCI militant sympathetic with the position of the Chalut-Montal tendency, but who remained in the party. Raoul wrote the following letter to Castoriadis in 1954. In it, Raoul complains about the consequences of these shifts and tries to inform Socialisme Barbarie of its consequences, for Raoul took to be the journal's core audience. Quote, I have no intention for the moment of talking about the Socialisme Barbarie group as it is currently, but simply, and in a few words, I want to talk again about the past. Things happened as they happened. You left when you left, and as you left. Is it not useless to go through it again? It probably could not have been otherwise. I want to say two things. One, when you left, surrounded by La Planche, Lefort, Balhache, I don't know how to say it, Bailhache, and then a little later came back for Bourg, it was impossible to follow you. All the more so because, not all the more so, it is the main reason, when Trotskyism was wrapped up, labeled, quote, mystifying, and rejected as a movement as pathetic, your journal did not even bother, even for 4 pages each issue, to follow the uneasiness of those who stayed, bracket, in the PCI, end bracket, and to respond to it at their level and in their way. 2. Knowing a little about your activity, when one reads the journal, one gets the impression, bracket, that Socialisme Barbarie is, bracket, a group of Marxist philo-econo-sociologists who leave to history, parenthesis, indeed without asking themselves whether this is a good idea, end parenthesis, the task of introducing, parenthesis, by osmosis undoubtedly, question mark, end parenthesis, to the class whose fundamental discoveries, those fundamental discoveries of which the aforementioned journal deems them worthy, end quote. Raoul. Raoul's basic complaint was that he felt abandoned by Socialisme Barbarie because it no longer linked itself directly or indirectly to Trotskyism. Raoul implies that the journal's initial audience was mostly Trotskyist militants like himself who found Socialisme Barbarie useful ammunition in factional activity. Socialisme Barbarie was initially understood as an ultra-left group of Trotskyist heretics. Raoul, for one, would have preferred them to remain that. By becoming something else, something less recognizable, the group had alienated its audience. For Raoul, the group and its journal had abandoned the working class and politics in favor of, quote, philosophico, economico, sociological, end quote, problems, couched in a difficult language used without regard for its reception. Regardless of what one makes of his pronouncements about the working class, Raoul's letter does point to the problem of the language that members of the group used in their writing, the difficulty of which increases the group's process turned inward. This placed Socialisme Barbarie's theoretical project at cross purposes with its political goals. The next chapter finds the group wrestling with this problem. The polarization of politics and the shutting down of the discursive space from which Socialisme Barbarie might have spoken, the collapse of the delimited field of ideological production from which the group had come, and the loss of its initial audience, all combined to isolate the group. This isolation and sense of powerlessness was written into the group's analysis of the international scene. As indicated earlier, Socialisme Barbarie saw the Korean conflict as the opening round of World War III. This war was the culmination of the logic of imperialism, driven by the abstract tendency of capital concentration. Political polarization precluded any possible revolutionary intervention by the working class. The onset of World War III confronted each member with a choice: wait around Paris for the inevitable Soviet occupation of France and work to construct clandestine resistance organizations, or leave France for Canada. Footnote. Camille and Néron soon found themselves in Canada. This account of their departure comes from a number of interviews, particularly with Vega, in April 1992. End footnote. 2 Socialisme Barbarie militants left soon after. Their departures combined with that of La Planche and others to reduce Socialisme Barbarie to less than a dozen members. One index of the straits into which this plunged the group was the Journal. Socialisme ou Barbarie had appeared 5 times during 1948 to 49. Only 3 slight issues came out between 1950 and 1952. To make matters worse, as the danger began to pass of the Korean War turning into World War III, Castoriadis and Laforce split over the question of Socialisme ou Barbarie's status as a political organization. The group ceased to exist for several months. Footnote: the texts generated during this dispute were published in Socialisme ou Barbarie No. 10, July to August 1952, under the heading Discussion sur les partis révolutionnaires, and include an introduction, La Direction Proletarienne, signed by Ch.1, and Les Proletariat et les problèmes de la direction révolutionnaire, signed by Montal. Ch.1 being Castoriadis, Montal being Claude Lafort. End footnote. This bleak period was also one of transition. A gradual influx of new members began when Socialisme ou Barbarie assimilated the internationalist tendency of the Bourgeois Union de Gauche Communiste, UGC, in 1950. This brought into the group Ramon Ritzel, Boer Gaspar, Alberto Masso, Vega, Jacques Signorelli, Garros, and Martin Gathra. In 1952, Martin's ex-husband, Jacques, Daniel Motet, also joined. Georges Petit, who had attended every meeting since he first heard about the Ch.1 tendency during 1947 without joining the group, and who would later manage the journal's circulation, finally became a member in 1951. By the end of 1952, Henri Simon had arrived. Jean-Francois and Andrea Lyotard, along with Pierre and Muriel Souris, began their involvement with the group during 1952 as well. Souris introduced Lyotard to Socialisme ou Barbarie while they were teaching together in Constantine, Algeria. They joined once they returned to Paris and remained active from the places to which their teaching assignments took them. The group was changing at the level of personnel and political background. These new members soon began to shape the new directions taken by Socialisme ou Barbarie's revolutionary project. That's the end of the chapter, and this is the end of part 2 of that chapter. I separated the recordings to make the videos a bit shorter. So thanks for listening.